It's not a crime. It's not a crime, George. Paying $130,000 to Stormy whatever and paying $150,000 to the other one is not a crime.
That's Rudy Giuliani's not a crime defense, but he is on his own island there because federal prosecutors, Michael Cohen, as we've been reporting, and the National Enquirer's own company, AMI, all suggest there was a criminal payment to impact the election, and the feds got cooperation from AMI. So what else does that tabloid company know? Well, my next guest could have some idea. Jerry George served 28 years as the LA bureau chief for the National Enquirer and predicted the company would flip on Trump despite their history together.
This was a magazine that, frankly, in many respects, should be very respected. I've always said, why didn't the National Enquirer get the Pulitzer Prize?
Big question there. Now, throughout the campaign, the Enquirer ran all sorts of damaging headlines about Clinton and Donald Trump's primary opponents in the Republican Party. The Times reports that some of those cover stories could be worth $3 million a month if you count them like political ads, each cover arguably more powerful than a tweet from an account with millions of followers. But Trump's links to the Enquirer may come back to haunt him. AMI chief David Pecker reportedly keeping a secret safe full of all sorts of other alleged Trump secrets and dirt that may not have come out. I'm joined by Jerry George, longtime editor at the Enquirer. You are certainly an insider. I appreciate you joining me on the beat to talk about this, sir.
Hi, Ari. Thanks for having me.
Go ahead.
Effectively, David Pecker sold his editorial soul for access to Trump World. And in doing so, he got closer to, the real power of the campaign. He did so, because he was always on guard, looking out for the next bankruptcy. So money is always important to him.
I thought he was really rich.
He is rich, but he still needs more money. He's an acquisitions guy.
If he was worried about bankruptcy and he's worried about stories and he's working with the Enquirer, was this a typical reporter-source relationship with the ethics involved in that, or was this more like a dirty business transaction?
Well, I think that David got close to the Trump pals, including Saudi money and Jared Kushner's banking friends. So he ultimately gathered some bargaining chips that he planned to use in time to get something he needed.
Do you have reason to believe Mr. Pecker knew other incriminating things about Trump that have not come out?
Yes, certainly.
Do you know what any of those are?
I know some of them. And there are stories involving, of course, the Trump-Kushner family. There are stories of, sibling rivaling with the children, backbiting, discord with his wife.
Would you describe them, because obviously we're talking about things that haven't come out and we obviously haven't verified them, but would you characterize them as merely embarrassing, if you will, or do any of them arise to the level of being potentially criminal?
Well, actually both. I mean, they're certainly embarrassing. And then when you get involved with, the actions of his children, including his daughter and son-in-law, we're getting closer to criminal activity.
Let me read to you, as we talk about criminal activity, the fact that this corporation that you know well from working there got this immunity suggested, you don't have to be a lawyer to know this, they needed some kind of immunity. Now, here's a federal prosecutor arguing of all corporations, a news company shouldn't expect to be unscathed when it acts illegally to undermine democratic norms, tip the electoral scales. AMI used corporate resources to illegally help Trump's candidacy. It should face more consequences. I understand that you worked there a long time. I'm sure there are people there that you do like and respect. But what's your view at the end of the day here? Do you think that AMI did act in concert with the Trump organization, Trump campaign to break the law, and should they be held accountable?
I think they did, and I think there is another shoe to drop. I mean, the special counsel's focus is now moving towards, the Saudis' role in all of this. and they may not be out of trouble yet.
Wow. Jerry, stay with me. What I want to do, you mentioned Jared Kushner. I want to bring in someone who worked directly for him. And the Daily Beast has reported Kushner basically replaced Cohen as the Enquirer's, Trump connection. Elizabeth Spires was editor-in-chief of the New York Observer, which at the time was owned by Jared Kushner. When you hear all this, first of all, what's your reaction? Does it square with your knowledge of the facts?
Sure. It doesn't surprise me. You know, I also think if you look at Trump's logic and the way that he delegates things, it's unsurprising that he would delegate my relationship to Jared. He tends to look at people around him who he's close to and he trusts, who might know a little bit of information about whatever the subject at hand is, which is how Jared ends up with a portfolio of responsibilities that are so disparate and weird. You know, but he did own a newspaper, so it makes sense that Trump would look at him and go, you know, you're the person who's going to handle this media relationship. And
one of the defenses that I'm sure you're familiar with is the idea that Donald Trump and Jared Kushner and some of the other people just weren't versed in this kind of stuff. So they just had no idea what they were doing. That might be a problem for running things. So if you, as having Jared as your boss, I'm not sure that you love that situation, but it certainly, to be fair, can comprise a valid legal defense if you have no idea what's going on. Here was Michael Cohen, though, in the new interview, basically saying, no, they knew exactly what they were doing towards the election. Take a look.
First of all, nothing at the Trump Organization was ever done unless it was run through Mr. Trump. He directed me to make the payments. He directed me to become involved in these matters, including the one with McDougal, which was really between him and David Pecker, and then David Pecker's counsel. I just reviewed the documents in order to protect him. You have to remember at what point in time that this matter came about, 2 weeks or so before the election, post the Billy Bush comments. So yes, he was very concerned about how this would affect the election.
Do you think that Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, to the extent he was involved in this, would be acting in that way, knowingly?
Well, I think it would be hard to make an argument that Jared would have had no exposure or knowledge of what was happening. You know, particularly if he was managing that relationship directly, who else on the Trump team would have known about it? You know, Cohen wasn't going to be chief of staff at that point. That's the entire reason why Jared ended up being the conduit to the White House. So I think it strains credulity to make an argument that Jared would have had no knowledge of that transaction.
Jerry, what do you think?
I definitely think that, you know, once Michael stepped aside, there was foot traffic between people in the Trump Organization, including Jared, into the American Media Organization.
And when you say another shoe to drop, can you give us any more insight on what you're talking about?
I think there's, I think the special that they racked last winter is particularly curious. It was racked at Walmart. It was a glossy. It had the cover of the. It had a picture of the prince on the cover. There were pictures of President Trump inside.
The prince
and
of.
It seemingly came out of left field. It wasn't the typical American media product.
Which prince?
MBS.
And so you're talking about your belief that there may be some other financial incentive for some of that coverage? I
certainly do.
And do you have, I have to ask this, do you have any specific evidence of that, or that's just what folks are talking about that you know at AMI?
It smells fishy. In addition to shortly after that cover was racked, American Media, which is basically a cash-poor company, somehow came up with the funding to buy up their competitors from the Bauer Organization. Suddenly there was an influx of cash. I think that's suspicious.
It certainly is the kind of thing that prosecutors would investigate, and your knowledge of it, your closeness to it is interesting. As we mentioned, these are investigative leads. These are not verified conclusions yet. Jerry and Elizabeth, two, I would say, heavyweight insiders in this wild media business. Thanks to both of you for joining us.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.